Yes, indeed.
Absolutely,
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So you want to use, there's a few things you could do, but one thing you want to try to use is soluble fibers compared to insoluble fibers. The grain you want to, as much as possible, soak. So one way to help, and it seems very simple, it's to extend the slow speed mix time, because there's a lot of competition for all that water, and the grain takes some time to absorb the water. So if you give it more time at slow speed mixing, it gives the time for the grain to rehydrate better. Some people would use a pre-soaking approach, but not all bakeries can do that. But that's a few things that you could do. The choice of the grain and fibers, some mix time extension of slow speed mix time for water, better rehydration. Yes.
Yeah, or a autolace period if you have the time to be able to do that, to extend your autolace as well, again, to allow the fibrous grains to hydrate properly. Especially even things like oats or bran, they take time. It takes time for them to pick up water.
Because when you're doing that, what you call the autolyze, you're allowing the natural occurring enzymes of the grains to act and start degrading themselves, because that's what they do.
Yep.
Yeah, with the right conditions. Huh?
If you're thinking about gluten reduction, maybe puff doughs are using some gluten, but you know, sometimes you need the protein to do its job physically, you know. So as you know, the replacement we suggest is not a physical replacement for gluten, and it's all based on functionality of enzymes and conditioning of the dough. But maybe I didn't answer the question right. Maybe Mark, you could help me better understand.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that if see something like a puff pastry or a croissant dough, we're usually not trying to strengthen it. It's more the other way around. We want to get relaxation. So it would be a different type of approach than with a high fiber bread in terms of a gluten alternative. This, by saying gluten alternatives, is we mean alternatives to adding additional wheat gluten. We're not trying to make a gluten-free fiber bread. This is to manage cost and crop variances and things like that. That these solutions. I kind of said that there. Maybe I'm psychic. I don't know. But I would say it might be helpful in some ways, but no, this is not to replace the functionality of gluten. It's to enhance the functionality of the gluten that is present.
I agree with Mark. It's exactly that. And of course, you know, gluten-free formulation, for me, there can be billions of different types of combination of bran or starches and everything. So it's very difficult to determine in advance the effect of the enzymes depending on the mix or the blend. And of course, it's not a physical replacement of gluten. So
yes,
maybe we could say on this topic that if we want to help you, the bakeries, improve your loaf quality of a gluten-free bread, you have to share with us the composition of the flour. Unless you do that, we cannot help you, because we it's like a shot in the dark. It's like a black box. We have no idea the amount of proteins, the type of proteins, and so we don't know which type of enzyme solution to suggest you.
Yes, I mean, you touched on the the lipases and use of enzyme active soy flour. So if they're using soy proteins and enzyme active soy flour, then that's a whole different approach in terms of whatever enzyme solutions you may be using to help enhance that or improve that situation, right?
In the process, yes, of course, there you just want to do a process which is stress-free as much as possible. One of the things I mentioned earlier is to mix longer at slow speed. On the process itself, you want, if it's possible, proofing at lower temperature, proofing the dough at lower temperature will create less damages on the protein, the gluten protein. So usually in the industry, temperature of proofing is around 105 degrees Fahrenheit or so. So if you could proof even at room temperature and use more yeast, that will definitely help you to get a better product, better dough stability, more strength.
Yep.
Mark, can you think of?
No, I agree, and I mean, with things that are, again, with going back to the fiber breads and things like that, is, as Luke mentioned, extended slow mixing to allow things to hydrate properly, and then fully mixing the gluten will give you your good dough strength. So make sure that you're fully developed. It's one of those things with baking. We need to always remember it's not simply about setting a timer on a mixer. Every time when a new load comes in, or at the very least when crop changes over, we have to adjust according to what the conditions of the flour are, because it's a natural product and it keeps changing and evolving. And because it was, a 10-minute mix time last month doesn't mean it's going to be a 10-minute mix time this month. If the grist has changed, particularly in areas that, here in Canada and the US, we are very fortunate. We have a lot of growing regions close by, and we have very consistent grists on our flour mills. But if you're in the Caribbean, or if you're in the Middle East or India and things like that, you have less options. Like I know in the Caribbean, they'll get a couple of boatloads in, and that's all they got to work with. There's very little blending that they can do, and they have to work with what they've received for that period of time. So as you have said, reducing proof temperature to slow the proofing will do less damage, and making sure things are mixed properly and or not over mixed as well. Right?
Well, there's a multiple type of hemicellulase. In general, the one that are coming from fungal microorganism, are less easy to overdose. But an overdosing of a bacterial oxalinase, even nowadays, they got better development on those. But what you would see a very slack and sticky dough, and very wet dough. And of course, if you keep it and you can make it through the process and proof it and bake it, then you would see probably an open crumb structure and a very wet and moisty crumb with a lot of moisture.
It could appear beneficial at first until you realize that it's going to increase the risk of molding. It could even appear almost ropey, and because it's so moist and sticky. It depends how badly you've overdosed, of course.
Exactly.
And I mean, the cost of enzymes is very effective and efficient because of the very low doses. but it's not something that you're going to put in by the pound, because you purchase the enzyme itself on a pound for pound basis is costly, right? So it's not something you're going to be wasteful with either.
And also always remember, more is not necessarily better.
Yes.
As Jacinthe explained, when you're formulating for a grain bread or a high fiber bread, you want to start with the base, the most cost-effective ingredients would be the oxidants. And then you want, the second choice would be to optimize with enzymes activity, different cocktail of enzymes. And then if you need more, we would probably tend to go to emulsifiers or even phospholipase enzymes that are creating emulsifiers if you want to keep it clean label. And then you might want to go to gums or hydrocolloids like guar gum or xanthan gum that would help to reduce and condition, make the dough a little bit more stable without adding gluten. But the final choice, should be always like gluten, especially nowadays. So it's the way I formulate usually, and it's been what I learned for more than 25 years, the way to formulate it. So you try to get as much bang for the buck, if you allow me to say. And that would be my suggestion for formulating with less gluten or no gluten.
Yeah, and it's looking again at the entire formula altogether. If you have a high fiber formula that is also high in sugar and doesn't have sufficient yeast, gluten and enzymes alone are not the solution. They are definitely part of it, but we also need to make sure that we are adjusting the yeast and we adjust processing, such as mixing, such as proofing. So I always want to reinforce that there isn't a black box silver bullet that you lower your gluten and then just boom, and it solves everything, right? It has to be looked at the entire picture altogether. And I really appreciate the way Luc has expressed that, you look at one part and then look at adding another part and then another part. And so there may be multiple steps to the solution to achieve precisely the objectives that you want for volume, texture, flavor, and so on. So and everything has to be looked at together, and that's why Lallemand stresses the cooperative approach, because they work together with the customer, not just give you an ingredient and say good luck, right? So, and I've had the good fortune of knowing Lallemand for a very long time through my career, and I've probably had the opportunity to work with Lallemand as long as Luc has been in the industry as well. So it's
I think so.
Yeah, it's a great company. Yeah.
And the minute the hydrogen peroxide hits the water, it would break into oxygen and water. But you can have the oxygen, the peroxide that could be working well in situ by only using enzyme. That's what Jacinthe explained earlier. The glucose oxidase will transform the glucose into gluconic acid and peroxide, and the peroxide will be produced in the dough during the process, and it can then react and produce that oxidizing effect. But adding hydrogen peroxide as is, I don't think would make it would work.
No.
Maybe in a continuous mix system where you have no oxygen. I don't know.
Yeah.
I know my wife is making beans at home, and usually we soak them overnight for best results. So depending on the fiber or the grain, I would suggest as long as possible to make sure all the water is well absorbed, and then you can strain them and use the grain with maybe some excess water, a little excess water. But that would be my recommendation, to soak as much as you can.
Yeah,
it depends also
even
on
soak the night before for the day after.
We can say it depends also like on the temperature. Like if like in the summertime, the soaking can be faster than in the winter time. And so
it makes sense, but I wouldn't know. I really don't know.
There are recipes where you can heat up the water and boil it, so that tends to accelerate the rehydration process as well.
Oh, boil it. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, and in most places where I've worked with these types of systems, it's been usually an overnight process. It's usually been part of the procedures in the bakery that they would pre-weigh for the next day's production and soak it, as long as you have the space for the troughs or the bins or things like that. I have experimented myself a little bit with almost as Jacinthe has suggested, with heating the water in almost a semi-tangzong type method, where having a lot of starchy type of grains like oats and things like that, where I boiled the water and then added boiling water to that blend and let that soak. And it improves the texture of the bread more than anything else. It also helps with the shelf life in terms of reducing staling, because those starches start to get unlocked already, so they don't recrystallize quite as readily in the whole process, right? It's almost, they're partially pre-gelatinized in that way, right? And so, but definitely soaking longer is better. Some grains may soak up fairly quick, but as I mentioned too earlier, like bran and oats or like with oat bran, the beta glucan and things like that, they take a long time to soak up water. That it takes time for that to blossom, so to speak. Similarly with chia seeds and things like that, it takes time, and so an overnight regime is usually the best. For smaller retail bakeries, there are companies that sell pre-soaked grains already in buckets, and this can be helpful in areas where if you are concerned about mold growth or something. So usually overnight that shouldn't be a problem, but you definitely don't want to create soakers that last several days, because then you could be introducing bacterial growth and things like that if you're not refrigerated or sterilized.
What I would explain from my understanding, the fact of, especially in Canada and in the US, a sponge and dough will condition the dough quite a bit. Yeast fermentation is already conditioning the dough quite a bit. And for that reason, on the dough side, usually you would need the requirement for conditioning would be lower in the sponge and dough process, to my understanding. While a straight dough process where there's no conditioning at all and everything is done in no time, then the oxidation and the requirement for dough conditioning would be higher in general, especially for white pan bread. Whole wheat bread, I don't see that much anymore of people doing the sponge and dough in the whole wheat bread, because of one of the reasons I was explaining earlier. Lots of damage done during the pre-fermentation on the whole wheat flour. So that would be my answer.
I'd agree with that. Yep.
Enzymes are specific to their substrate, or the molecule of affinity they have. And usually whatever flour you have, it all depends on the content of the flour itself, and it's the flour quality, and the enzyme will always do the same job. Some flours will require higher level of enzyme. Some flour will require lower level of enzymes. So it's not that the enzyme activity is changing with the flour. It's always the same activity. It's only the flour characteristics that are changing.
Yes. If you're using a whole wheat flour with a whole bunch of other insoluble fiber that you're adding, it's going to be a little bit different type of approach than just something that is a white flour with some fiber added to it.
Oh, it's a very good sign. On the dough side, you know, from the dough perspective, the dough will be very elastic unless you beat it to death. But you gotta mix for a very long time if you use a high level of gluten to make the dough very extensible. That's almost impossible. So the dough is very elastic, so not easy to machine. So to process on the line, and on the final product, what I would say, if you keep it and proof it to the final proof and bake it, what you would see an excess expansion in the oven, and sometimes you would see, or it's very almost all the case, you see holes in the crumb because the dough is so elastic that during the molding process, or the dough is so it doesn't obey that much, and there's pockets of holes created in the crumb. That's some of the few things you could see if you use too much gluten.
Yeah, a colleague of mine used to often use the term bucky. The dough will be very bucky. It pulls back a lot.
That would be the same answer as I did earlier. Once you optimize step by step, you know that your oxidation is optimized, your enzyme combination is optimized, your emulsifier level and phospholipase level is optimized, and you don't get to the final volume you want or the dough stability you want, then you would have to add gluten, and that's when you decide to add gluten and how much to add to get to the. You decide, you go by step. I understand in the plant it's not easy to do, but usually that's step-by-step procedure that can help you, because otherwise it's hard to determine what was done by what product or what ingredients, and you might simply use too much of one ingredient that you might have not needed. Well, reducing gluten, gluten can be conditioned, but in general, reducing gluten will decrease the dough elasticity. When I say elasticity, sometimes people confuse the two of them. Elasticity is if I stretch the dough, it will tend to shrink back or snap back. That's elasticity. While extensibility, the dough you can stretch and the dough will obey and extend easily. So you always want a good balance between elasticity and extensibility. That's the name of the game in baking. Yep. So you want to balance these two. So that's the way we determine this. It's kind of a bit at the same time an art and a science. You just have to figure out if the dough is can be processed as you want, and adjust accordingly, but usually decreasing gluten will decrease the elasticity. Well, that all depends if you're talking about functional ingredients or if you're talking about characteristic ingredients. In general, the formula can stay as is, like sugar, salt. Although salt has a great effect on production of grain bread and whole wheat bread, because it has this strengthening effect that you like to have. So both, but in general, all the characteristic ingredients like salt, sugar, oil, or milk powder, or whatever you can put in there, to create flavor and give the characteristic of the bread, it can stay the same. Functional ingredients, you might be able to reduce the functional ingredients if you use a dough conditioner or reduce gluten. Maybe I'm not sure I answered the question right, but that's my answer.
No, I think that's fair answer. Because functional ingredients may have an opportunity to be changed, but may not require to be changed, and other things that can just remain the same, right? Without having any changes. I'd agree.
Oh, that's a very good question. Wheat tortilla, usually you don't want to use too much extra gluten or added gluten. The way I see it, usually we don't formulate with extra gluten. The gluten, of course, on the dough would make the dough much more elastic, not that easy to press or sheet, depending on the process you're using to make the tortilla. And of course, for the final product, the more gluten you have in the final product, the more competition there is for the moisture. So the more moisture migration there might be in the product, and maybe some drying out of the premature drying out of the product can occur. It all depends on the gluten level and how much hydration you put in there. But to my knowledge, I'm not sure if usually gluten is needed to be added in wheat tortilla. But Mark, do you have an idea about this?
No, I agree with you, Luke. I mean, most of the time is not adding wheat gluten. I mean, the starch, the staling in terms of the flexibility of the tortilla it's got more to do with the starch and the lubricants like the fat that is in the system. If a primarily saturated fat is used, the fat actually hardens a lot easier, and it has an effect even in the baked product of then the tortilla staling quicker. So a low or a reduced saturated fat will help with things like that. The gluten itself, no, it would make the tortillas too elastic. They would shrink back too much during the press and cause too many other issues more than any benefit that I could see. Well, I think that's all we got for today. If you have any other questions, please go to our Baking Industry Professionals group on Facebook. And there's lots of conversations there, and we'd be glad to help you out there. For any other information regarding the strengthening solutions from Lallemand, you can go to www.lallemandbaking.com. Thank you very much, Luke and Jacinthe, for your time. This has been a wonderful seminar, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next one.